My name is Kalkura. I work on the foundation on G20, G8, and international advocacy, looking at how these international forums can make a change on key development issues. And so looking at public perception in these countries and understanding how decision makers, influencers, and interested citizens view development is quite relevant. And I found reading the report fascinating and very helpful. We've been working with InterMedia since 2009, and we looked to set out with them to better understand audiences and how audiences were reacting to international development, how we could reach out to them more effectively. And we first grant with them put a resource called AudienceScapes, which looks at how does media market information from lots of countries, and it's a really interesting space, and encourage you to take a look at that. This latest report was commissioned by our communications team to look at the donor countries, which is France, Germany, UK, US, and then, interestingly, the emerging market, China. As we know, the BRICS are rising up, and China is becoming a key market and key audience for us. We're going to base a lot of our own communication strategy on this report. We were quite interested in the fact that, for example, key government decision makers don't use social media, and they use traditional media in established markets like the US and UK, but in China, the established media is not the preferred source of information. So there was some interesting local context, as well as making us rethink how we approach some of our communication strategies for some of our key audiences. So all this work is available on the AudienceScapes, and encourage you to look at that. It's a very useful resource. And I think we're very quickly just hand you over to Peter, who will introduce the panel as well as be the moderator for the question and answer session after the presentation.
Thank you, Kel. I'll just very quickly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jerry Power, who is the Managing Director of our InterMedia UK branch. He worked very closely with the Gates Foundation on this project. Next to him is Clara de Belliac, who is an Associate Director at InterMedia, also in our London office, who is the principal author of the Building Support Report. Next to her is Paul Miller, who is a Foreign Aid Advisor from Catholic Relief Services. And after the presentation, he's going to provide us a little bit of the perspective from the NGO world and the impact of engagement from their perspective. And next to him is Charles Kenny, who is a senior fellow, I believe, from the Center for Global Development. And he's also going to put things in perspective a little bit in terms of general views on attitudes and opinions about foreign assistance and how this report relates to those trends. So I'll pass it over to Jerry right now to give a brief introduction. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jerry Power. As Peter said, I'm Managing Director of InterMedia in London, and worked with my colleague Clara de Belliac on this research over the last 12 months. Over the last 2 or 3 months, we've presented this research in Seattle, at European Development Days in Warsaw back in November, in Paris at a meeting of the Gates Foundation grantees, and also in Belgium to Europe Aid, and most recently to the Bond Group in the UK. And it's been very interesting presenting these findings to a number of different, not only national organizations invested in international development. Before I want to essentially contextualize the research based on what we've learned from those presentations and those meetings. And I also want to acknowledge the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for supporting this work, and also to have worked very closely with us over the last year as the work evolved. There are 3 things I think that are important to mention to contextualize the findings of this research. First of all, international development is a very, very complex phenomenon. It involves trade, fair trade, debt, aid, corruption. And so the challenge to communicate what international development is to ordinary citizens, and even to some extent to influentials, is not an easy challenge. And we've seen that the difficulty of doing that reflected back in the findings in the sense that people don't understand what these terms mean. They don't understand the international aspect. They don't understand the development aspect. They don't understand terms like food security, global health. And so the vocabulary and the language and the nomenclature that's common to the people in this room is not common to ordinary citizens. And we should not overestimate the extent of that challenge. The second point, I think, that helps contextualize the findings is this notion of engagement. What we mean by engagement. Because there are so many different definitions of what it means to be engaged with international development. And once one is engaged, what does that imply? What does that infer? What does that suggest about what's going to happen as a result? So this defining engagement with international development is a key challenge for individual organizations and individual stakeholders, but also for the sector more generally. And I think that leads me to the third point that I wanted to mention in terms of contextualizing the research, and that is agreeing or building consensus around what the challenge is. What does success look like if we have an engaged citizenry, if we have engaged policymakers, if we have engaged influentials? What constitutes success? Because so much of what we've learned, and there are aspects of this research that one could characterize as being very tactical, is that there seems to me to be an absence of a strategy within the sector as to what we're working towards collectively. Not individually as individual organizations or as individual policymakers or individual influentials, but as a sector. The absence of an agreed sense of a shared mission. And this point was particularly poignant for us when we presented in London to the Bond Group. And some of you may be familiar with Bond. It's the membership organization of NGOs or charities in the UK working in international development. And there was a real strong sense among the participants in that workshop of all these diverging priorities and issues and strategies, and the absence of a shared sense of direction. However, I would recommend to you, those of you who are interested in this question, to look at a fascinating report produced by Andrew Darnton and Martin Kirk of Oxfam, entitled Finding Frames. And the thesis of the Finding Frames research is essentially that in order to have a strategic focus for the work, that it's important to agree on a set of values around which information and content and communications around international development would be framed. And that thesis is informed by a very, very thorough quantitative and qualitative analysis of the trends in the UK in particular in terms of citizen support for international development or for support for poor countries or poverty or in developing countries. And there's two references in the report that I think have resonance for the findings here. One is what's referred to as the Live Aid legacy. The Live Aid legacy is essentially characterized as wealthy countries giving to poor countries. So a traditional kind of a charitable relationship, which is very problematic in a shifting kind of global economy, which is tending much more towards partnerships. The second reference is made is to the Making Poverty History legacy, which essentially was an attempt to inform the public about international development in a much more complex way, to say that it's not about charity, it's actually about justice. But the research would suggest that while a lot of the UK public remember the Making Poverty History event, what was lost on them was the message, the underlying message about justice, and that really the issue, or the salient issue, was about justice, not charity. And it was fascinating reading their summary of the findings of the research after Make Poverty History, because there was such an emphasis on people saying, well, we don't know how much money they made around Making Poverty History. The underlying assumption was that it was a fundraising event, rather than a strategic effort to mobilize the UK public around development as a justice issue rather than a charity issue. So I wanted to make those comments at the beginning of the presentation to essentially contextualize the value of what we're sharing here, which in some ways, as far as we understand, is unprecedented in terms of the scale of the work and the consistency of the work in gathering data from three key constituencies: citizens, policymakers, and influentials. And within the influentials, a very key group, we looked at bloggers across the 5 countries. But we asked those questions of those 3 groups across 5 countries. And we, as far as we understand, that has never been done before. There's a lot of work that's been done in the UK. The UK has invested a lot of resources, particularly DFID. DFID do this regular, I think it's an annual poll. There's some questions around support for international development in the Eurobarometer study. There's been some interesting work done by AusAid around Australian citizens' engagement around international development, but no study that asked a systematic set of questions across the 5 countries that we've asked these questions. So we're very proud of the work. We hope that the production of the report and the micro-reports, which are all over here at the side, is not the end of a process, but actually the beginning of a process. And in the spirit of making in some ways, a modest contribution to that, we have launched a portal on the AudienceScapes website where the content will be available, and where we're inviting people who are interested in these issues and the questions that the research raises to actually engage with us and with each other. So thank you for coming this morning. I'm going to stop and hand over to my colleague Clara, who did the real work.